Thanks, Yvonne. Yeah, undoubtedly, this is the biggest military test that the regime in Myanmar has faced since the coup. As you mentioned, I mean, the rebel groups say that they've overrun more than 100 regime outposts, and they have released footage to confirm at least some of these outposts have been captured. But they've also captured towns in northern Shan state, which is just not something that we've seen up until this point in the conflict.
Tom, which groups make up the rival insurgent forces and can they compete against the military junta?
Well, even before the coup, there was around 20 ethnic armed groups in Myanmar. But since the coup, we've seen many, many new groups form. They range in size, in capacity. But the three groups that launched this offensive in northern Shan state are among the most experienced, the best equipped forces in the country. And they are really posing a massive threat to the regime. I don't think the military has been in this level of peril since the coup. I mean, this is a huge test.
How has the military government responded to the offensive?
Part of the reason why the ethnic armed groups overran so many outposts was because the military did withdraw from some of them. It was a tactical retreat to try to conserve some of its forces. It has vowed to counterattack, to retake some of these areas, and we have seen some forces inserted, but the response has been relatively subdued from the military, and this reflects the fact that it's fighting on so many fronts around the country. Just yesterday, the Arakan army launched new attacks in Rakhine State in the west of the country as well. So the military really is stretched, and there's not a huge reserve force that it can insert into these conflict zones.
And the fighting's forcing thousands of people to leave their homes to flee for safety. What are concerns of humanitarian groups?
Yeah, according to the UN, we're looking at perhaps 50,000 people displaced as a result of this recent fighting. But, you know, there's already close to 2 million people displaced inside the country. Access to displaced people is extremely limited because there's an active conflict going on, and also the regime restricts access. That's part of its strategy to undermine its opponents, is to limit the ability of humanitarian groups to reach displaced populations because it thinks that some of the aid might end up in the hands of those armed groups, its opponents. So it's a very, very difficult situation to try and help people who have been displaced.
And Tom, how concerned is neighbouring China about the fighting that's going on near its border?
Yeah, China has always put a high priority on stability in the border area, but it has taken a very interesting position on this this conflict, this renewed fighting in Shan State. It actually hasn't intervened in a particularly strong way, and that's partly because the rebel groups have attacked areas where some military aligned forces were running cyber scam operations, and China was very upset about these operations. And so it's taken a sort of a hands-off approach and seems to be waiting to see how the fighting unfolds before intervening in a more serious way.
Do you think Beijing has a role to play in trying to broker a peace deal?
It's very tricky. I don't think Beijing thinks that it can really broker peace in Myanmar. I think what it wants to do is to limit the fallout from some of the conflict and to protect its economic interests inside the country. But in terms of peacemaking, I don't think Beijing is under a lot of illusions about what can be achieved in Myanmar, given there are so many groups opposed to military rule.
You were mentioning before fighting in Shan State, it's spread, it could be impacting the military's control in other parts of Myanmar. Do you think the junta can be overwhelmed?
What we've seen so far is fighting mainly, in the last couple of weeks, has been an increase in fighting in mainly ethnic minority areas of the country, which are sort of the borderland areas, upland areas. And that's where the regime is really at risk of losing control. It's a slightly different story in the central parts of the country, although this has reinvigorated opposition forces inside the center of the country as well. And we've seen the military lose control of some towns in these central areas. So, as I said, I mean, this is the biggest military test that the regime has faced since the coup. And I think there's a sense that it's really it's struggling to respond, and that's encouraging more armed groups to join the fight because they feel like the military is at a weak point and it's quite vulnerable.
Just lastly, how long do you think the fighting will continue for before the junta could possibly be overthrown?
That's the million-dollar question. It's very difficult to say. I mean, I think at the moment the risk is that the military could lose control of areas, ethnic minority areas, more on the border areas, the fringe of the country, rather than the central areas. But certainly, you know, we've seen the military lose quite a number of soldiers, and this has, as I mentioned, reinvigorated opposition forces in the center of the country. So it's very difficult to say, especially with so many moving parts. I mean, we're talking hundreds of armed groups fighting against the military, you know, how this might unfold. But it's clear that Naypyidaw is the generals in Naypyidaw are very rattled by what has unfolded in recent weeks. You know, they've called a meeting of the National Defense and Security Council, which is not something that they've done to date since the coup, except for when they've been constitutionally required. So it's very clear that they're rattled and they're trying to work out how they can respond.
Tom Kean from the International Crisis Group, thanks so much for your time and talking to us.
Thanks, Yvonne.